Okay, I think we are recording. So welcome everyone to our November Campus is Living Lab and Sustainability Communicators Network joint webinar. My name is Laura Lynn, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Campus is Lab Community Practice. And today I will be the facilitator of our panel discussions. First, we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Since we have two of our three panelists from Princeton, we would like to share Princeton's land acknowledgement today. So the land on which Princeton University stands is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenape people. We pay respect to the Lenape peoples past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora. I apologize if I didn't pronounce anything correctly. I should have practiced that beforehand. So a little bit of background behind both of our networks. The Sustainability Communicators Network currently has about 277 members across very different post-secondary institutions in North America and beyond. They host quarterly webinars on a variety of topics, and coming in 2022 will be even more resources, trainings, a mini virtual communications conference, and more. The network curates communications resources through the Google Drive, and they are open to collaborative projects. So you can contact Lisa Nicolaison, who is one of our panelists, to join, and it's open to all. Our Campus Lab community of practice currently has about 200 members across various post-secondary institutions in North America and beyond. We host monthly webinars on a variety of topics. We also curate a selection of Campus Lab resources through a shared Google Drive. We are very open to collaborative projects as well, and you can contact me or Rochelle Haddock if you wish to join. So today's panel will be focusing on how we use communications to highlight our Campus Lab work. And so our panelists will be Lisa Nicolaison, Jared Flesher, and Michelle Presley. So Lisa Nicolaison is a communications and outreach professional with over 9 years of experience in sustainability in higher education. She was formerly the engagement and communications manager with Princeton University's Office of Sustainability. And we will have these slides available at a later date, so I will let you read the rest of the bio a little bit later. Jared is a New Jersey-based documentary filmmaker and video producer with a background in journalism. His short and feature films cover an extensive range of environmental topics. And he's also the founder of video production company 100 Year Films. So again, I will let you read Jared's full bio a little bit later. Finally, Michelle Presley is a communicator, storyteller, and lover of the outdoors. She currently works in community and media relations for Leon County government. And she's also a writer and the host of podcast Outside Influence. And again, I'll let you read the rest of Michelle's bio a little bit later. So without further ado, I will stop sharing. And at this time, we're going to have all three of our presenters share a little bit more about their background and how they utilize communications to highlight Campus Lab projects. Each presenter will have about 10 minutes to speak. And we would ask that you hold any questions to the end. So we're going to have about 30 minutes of Q&A at the end of the session. If you have a burning question that you want to remember, you can write it down in the chat, and Rochelle will be keeping track of any of those questions so that we can ask them at the end. And if there's a specific sustainability communications topic that you would like to explore further, we are open to also hosting other collaborative webinars in the future about specific topics. So that's also another great thing you can share in the chat. So at this time, I would like to invite Lisa to speak.
Great, thank you, Laura Lynn. Thanks everyone for joining with us today. And I want to give another thank you as well to Rochelle and the whole Campuses Lab community practice for partnering with us on today's webinar. This has been, I don't know, a few months in the making, I guess. We were really excited to come together and bring both of our networks together. It's really nice to see some familiar names and faces and some new folks as well. So for those who haven't met me or we haven't had a chance to interact, I'm Lisa Nicolaison. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm formerly the engagement communications manager with Princeton University, but I've since left the university and I'm going to be starting my own consulting business in the new year focused on sustainable communications in higher ed and nonprofits. I founded the Sustainable Communicators Network about 3 years ago, and we have over 200, close to 300 members. And we have, monthly calls, things like that. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out. Love to share our resources with you and have you attend our calls. But as part of those calls, I was finding that we weren't really touching on Campus's Lab quite a lot at all. And with our new Campus's Lab assistant director, Joma, who joined our office just this past year, we've been having a lot of conversations about strategic communications around Campus's Lab and how do we tell these stories. And Jared, who will speak in a little bit, does the video work for Princeton University. And we primarily had been telling stories through video, but there's just so many different platforms that you could utilize for Campus's Lab. And it can be hard to really start to take a research project or something that's a little bit more technical and a little bit more maybe outside your realm. I know for myself personally, a lot of the communications that I would focus on for the office was around more student life, campus life, engagement programming, maybe the events or programming initiatives that the students were doing. And Campus's Lab wasn't really making its way into our communications as much as it could have been. And part of that was because for a long time, we didn't have a focused staff member on Campus's Lab. And I'm sure many of you have, wear many hats, and maybe this is just one of the many things you do as part of your office. You do communications, you are working with faculty and students to promote Campus's Lab or to make those connections for research. And so you're just not sure how to bring it all together. So one of the things that I want to just emphasize right off the bat is partnerships. This is something that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, just the idea that because you're wearing so many hats, because you're doing so many things, it can be really challenging to just do this as as one person, or even with the support of your office, or maybe student workers or interns. And especially because Campus's Lab, for the most part, I know at Princeton, it really brings a lot of different facets together. It's connecting operations, it's connecting academics, it might be connecting campus life as well, just depending on what the project is. And so I can't emphasize enough partnering with faculty, academic departments, maybe your central communications office, to sit down and think about what does the story of Campus's Lab look like at your campus. So just even taking that initial step back and thinking about, what is Campus's Lab? How do I communicate this concept to people? This is something that we've struggled with a lot over the years because it's an interesting concept. It has like a fun, catchy phrase, but people weren't connecting with it. And so how do you get people to understand, what does this mean? How do you get students and faculty excited about doing research on your campus instead of going abroad or doing, research focused entirely, somewhere else? So how do you make those connections? And so through partnerships, that's, obviously the key, because they want to tell those stories as well. And so sometimes it can just be beneficial to all of you if you work together on whatever type of communications that you want to tell. I also want to emphasize to only really take on what is feasible, because as I'm sure many of you know, you're maybe trying to do too many things. And with communications especially, you might be like, I want to be on Instagram, I want to have a YouTube channel and do videos, I want to do a podcast, I want to do this. But sometimes you just got to take a step back and think about, what are the platforms that are most beneficial to the stories that you want to tell? What makes the most sense for the stories? For each research project may even have a better mode or platform to tell that story. So for example, at Princeton, we have an on-campus composting facility called the Scrap Lab. And when we first launched it, we did a lot of different things. We did video, we did, story, we had an event. But one of the most fun things we started was a blog. And so the staff member who oversees and manages that facility runs the blog. And it's a really nice way to both highlight the research, but also she has students who work at the Scrap Lab who manage it. And they also contribute. So they write blog articles. They write about not just the composting at the Scrap Lab, but they also write about composting in New Jersey. They write about different food waste topics. They kind of expand beyond just this topic. And it has a pretty good readership rate, both with alumni, Princeton alumni, and like students who've either been at the Scrap Lab or done this work. Also like higher beyond New Jersey, like different networks within composting are really interested in learning more about the facility. So it's just one tangible example. And it's one project that, that one person could sort of manage and figure out, okay, how many blog posts can I feasibly do? What's the amount of work that I could take on to do this? And obviously documentation through photos, things like that. It's just a really nice, tangible way to do that. And if someone, I can put the blog link in the chat when I'm done yammering on. And as I sort of mentioned as well, Campuses Lab, communications itself, it comes in several forms. So you have to kind of think about, you're communicating what is Campuses Lab, that's a big part of it, but you're also communicating about the research. So highlighting who's doing the research, whether it's a student or faculty, and then what is the connection with your campus sustainability initiatives. So I just briefly want to share my screen. Let's see if I can do this quickly. All right, does everyone see this? I'm just conscious of time too. I've got a little bit, 3 minutes.
We can see it, Lisa, you bet.
So I just put this resource guide together, and I want to also thank Ijoma from Princeton University, because we've done a lot of work on this. And so a lot of this has come straight from what we've done when we approach how we communicate about Campuses Lab. And don't worry about like taking screenshot or whatever, because we're going to share this resource guide with all of you. It's really about the basics of storytelling. And I know many of you have experience with storytelling, or maybe you're just new to this, but a lot of the basics of telling a story, you want to use that when you're talking about Campuses Lab. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about as well is sort of, depending on the platform, depending on whether it's a video, an article, that blog I mentioned, social media, you can delve into this topic. You can talk about methodology, you can talk about impacts locally, a broader impact, environmental justice, and you can really, take the communications that you do, whatever platforms you decide that you can handle, whether it's just a newsletter that you put out. We actually started this right this past semester, trying out a sort of encompassing Campuses Lab newsletter that included all of the recent projects, including videos. We could put a link to it as well. So maybe some of those stories went into more detail because the project was complete, or maybe those stories were just getting started because the research was just, I don't know, they just dug the hole in the ground, that kind of thing. So depending on where the timeline is at as well is another big part of telling the Campuses Lab story. And so you may not even touch on methodology yet. You may not even touch on some of these things, but these are all kind of things to think about when you're communicating Campuses Lab. So we'll share this. And in addition to sort of the more Campuses Lab specific, I also have from previous workshops that I've done sort of an outline of how you would craft a campaign. So similar to the above, really thinking about your audience, thinking about what is the intended outcome? What do you actually want people to do when they read your story or go to your blog? Do you want them to do something? Do you want them to subscribe? Do you want them to attend an event? Do you want them to participate in the research? Is it a student audience and you want them to do Campuses Lab research? And so what is the message there? So there's a lot of different ways to think about a campaign or a story. And then the impact. So when you do communications, you have to actually say, did I do it well? So I set a timer. So I'm done with my time, but I just wanted to share this, and we will share this out, and I'm obviously available for questions at the end. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I apologize for mispronouncing your last name. Again, I should have practiced ahead of time. All right, at this time, I'd like to welcome Jared to present a little bit more about his work.
Thank you. So Lisa mentioned people wearing different hats, and I wear at least 2 different hats professionally, and the hats look kind of similar, but they actually feel quite different to me. About half the time, I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I have my own video production company, so I'm hired by clients to tell documentary style stories. And then about the other half of the time, I work specifically on a contract for the Princeton University Office of Sustainability. making all sorts of videos for them. I use the same equipment, I come with the same set of skills, but honestly, the two jobs feel very different to me, kind of from the starting point. When I go out to make a documentary film, the first thing I think about are, as Lisa mentioned, kind of these classic tenets of storytelling, which is character. Who is the star, or who are the stars of this story? But then after character, I go right to conflict, right? Like, what is the conflict here? What are the emotions, right? Like, the purpose of video and visual storytelling is you can draw out emotions in people. And then I also think about things like a cinematographer would think about, like visual beauty and art and creativity, right? And those all go into documentary filmmaking. And for whatever reason, when I do work for universities, and I think it's kind of a default, is you kind of start from this place of, okay, so what information are we going to give people, right? Like we want to tell people some set of facts that we want them to understand. And I think there are reasons for that. One of them is that the goal of storytelling is, quite frankly, just to tell the best story you can that gets people excited or have an emotional response. Whereas when you're working for a university, there are things like, we're promoting the brand, or we're promoting the work. And I guess my advice to people who use video and all sorts of storytelling at the university level is to try to take as many of those elements of kind of out of the box documentary storytelling, including risk taking, and apply them to the storytelling you're doing. And I'll give you an example. Lisa mentioned the Scrap Lab, which is this big composting system on campus. And it got shut down and moved because there's construction on campus. And when it got moved, there was an opportunity to make some improvements to the system. And we want to tell a story of, like, what changed. And I was talking to the manager of that project and kind of throwing out, we could take some photos, or we could, and there's a blog. And I was kind of thinking, well, if I was telling a story about the Scrap Lab, what would be a story I would want to watch? And they need an entirely new set of workers because the Scrap Lab has been shut down for a while. So what if we follow a student who is on campus and needs a job and is looking for something interesting, and you learn about the Scrap Lab not through facts and figures, but by a young student who needs to make some money and is interested in sustainability. And Scrap Lab is kind of a dirty, smelly job, so it's not for everyone. So, actually, maybe they won't like it when they get there, or maybe they will. And that's kind of like a simple, but I think good example of how to approach storytelling in a different way. And video production, I would say, is usually a time expensive and just flat out expensive way to tell a story. Sometimes if you just want to transmit information, a blog post or an article or a photo is an easier, faster, cheaper way to do it. So we're always talking about at the Office of Sustainability, what stories lend themselves to video? Like, why bother if we're going to put all this effort into it? And certainly those stories where you have a strong character or a narrative are good as well. But another example is quite simply a story where the visuals will be very strong, or you could take people on a visual journey. So using the Scrap Lab, again, as an example, we wanted to show people how the Scrap Lab worked. So we made a video called Journey of a Food Scrap, where with my camera, I followed starting out at the campus dining hall, carrots getting chopped and potatoes being chopped, and then those three things being thrown into the compost bin. Those go to the loading dock. From the loading dock, they get transferred by truck to the Scrap Lab, and then the students take the barrels and they dump it in, and then it all gets, goes through the composter for a week. And, we have some subtle informational screens along the way, but it's mostly visual and there's music. And then you follow that finished compost out into the world where it's used and it's spread to fertilize some trees. I think a lot of times videos, including the videos I've made, are information heavy. when maybe they shouldn't be, when again, I think emotion and, visual beauty are kind of what makes videos good and watchable. I don't know if anybody saw that movie Dune. There's that quote like, fear is the mind killer. I think for communicating what we're doing, too much information is the mind killer. That's when people click off. And you can always put a caption under the video, or you could always run it with an article. But I think really think of videos as a way to show people something and express emotion, and then just stop. You don't need to explain everything in the video. Speaking specifically about Campus as Lab videos, one area in which I feel there's a lot of possibility, and they remind me of documentary films, is that there's a process and time passes, right? Like we've all made those, or I've made those videos where you talk to a student, they did some project, they stand in front of their painting or their technical thing they created, and they talk to you about it for 2 minutes and like, you're done, right? But the best Campus as Lab videos, and what we've talked about in the Office of Sustainability, is ones where we could follow the process from beginning to end, and we don't even know where the story is going to go. And it might take a year, it might take 3 years, but we're going to get those visuals as we go. And just 2 more quick examples of that before I wrap up is there's a civil engineer who's studying formulations of concrete on campus that are being used that are lower in embodied carbon emissions. So there's a fly flying around my room, sorry. So I followed him to the concrete factory where they are pouring concrete in precast molds, right? And then 2 months later, and he was installing fiber optic sensors into the concrete so that over 5, 10, 20 years, they could measure the durability of this new kind of concrete compared to traditional concrete, right? And then 2 months later, we're at the East Parking Garage construction site with these huge cranes, and they're carrying these precast concrete slabs and putting them down. And then I did a formal interview with him and his grad student about why they're doing it and what they're doing it. So by being there every step of the way, I have all this material that tells a story that shows time passing instead of just that like on the spot story. I'm gonna post something in the chat, just a few links, hopefully this works, of what I consider like some better stories I've done and some worser stories I've done. There's Journey of a Food Scrap, very visual. And then the next link down, Journey from Old School Bus to Energy Efficient Living Space. There's this really funky, interesting student who was dead set on buying an old bus and turning it into a place he could live. And he thought it would take him a couple months, and he got some funding from the university. And like 4 years later, or 3.5 years later, he finally finished right before graduation. And, I wasn't there for every step of the way, but I was able to check in with him 3 or 4 times over those years. And it creates this sense of time passing. And I think that's where Campus as Lab projects really shine, because things do happen. And then just really quickly, solar powered smart window inserts is the example of the kind of video that I make all the time, but like is a little bit lacking in that I only had one chance. The student was graduating. He stood in front of his window that he created, and he talked about it for 2 minutes. And it's fine, and it transmits information. It gets the story apart. But had I been there all along the way, like it could have been, I think, a stronger story. So those are just some ideas to throw your way. I think that's probably about 10 minutes.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jared. And we will be saving not only the video recording, but also the chat. So you will have access to all of these wonderful links, resources that are being shared in the chat. And if you have any resources too, this is an open forum. Feel free to drop any resources that you have, any videos, podcasts, blogs, newsletters that you think are really great examples of Campus Lab communications into our chat as well, and that will get saved and shared and archived. So thank you again so much, Jared. And at this time, I'd like to welcome Michelle to share her 10-minute presentation.
Thanks, Laura Lynn, and thanks so much to Rochelle for having me on the call, and to my other panelists, Lisa and Jared. It's great to be here on the panel with you. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Michelle Presley, and I currently work as a public information specialist for Leon County government, and previously worked as the communications coordinator for a sustainable campus at FSU. So between those 2 roles, I did a lot of storytelling, still do a lot of storytelling and a lot of communications. And like many other people on this call, I also wear a lot of hats. So when I'm not at work, I am usually working on my podcast, Outside Influence, which is about how media, culture, and politics shape our outdoor experiences. So both in a professional capacity, a lot of storytelling, and then personally, is also what I love to take on in personal podcasting and other writing projects. So I'll probably lean a lot on all of those experiences as we go through today, but probably going to touch on some other things that my fellow panelists have talked about. But I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about being the only communications professional in the room. And I had a lot of that experience while working at Sustainable Campus. And for people who are working in Campus as a Living Lab, you might be the only communications person in the room, even if you're not a communications professional. If you're wearing your communications hat in that moment, and you're the only one that's kind of looking through that lens and thinking about storytelling, then I think that that could be impactful. And then too, if you work with communications professionals, they are likely the only communications person in the room at any given point when working on Campus as a Living Lab or other sustainability projects. So I think in terms of storytelling and kind of capturing the value of Campus as a Living Lab projects and thinking about what it means to be the only communications professional in the room, we've talked a lot about what makes a good story, right? The arc, the characters, what you want people to do or take away when they're listening to that story, watching that story, all the different mediums that you can do storytelling through. But I personally like to break it down into questions. And so a story will have the who, it'll have the characters, it'll have the what, the general story arc, the line, the conflict, and then it'll be the where and when. So the setting, and like Jared talked about, kind of signposting those various points throughout a Campus as a Living Lab or any other project or any other story. And then there's the why. And so you're probably serving a lot of different functions with telling the story, like other presenters have mentioned. You know, you want to build the university's brand, you want to establish your program, you want to recruit for more Campus as a Living Lab projects, really grow the program. And then there's my favorite question, and the one that I think, me personally, I like to ask myself and when I am the only communications professional in the room. And that question is, so what? And that question comes off as maybe a little bit abrasive, but it doesn't necessarily have to be phrased as a just so what. But I think when you are a communications person, you really have to like internalize the so what, and it should be after every single other question, after the what, after the who, after the why. So what is usually the thing that follows, and in my experience, it's usually the thing that is forgotten. And in the projects that I'm less proud of, it's because I felt like I didn't really do a good job of answering the so what. And so just to give maybe a personal example, my partner is about to graduate with an electrical engineering degree. And so our careers and life paths are very different. He does so much math and so much technical work and really cool projects. And so he'll come home at the end of the day and he'll kind of excitedly tell me about a project that he might be working on with the city's utility department or something that he's working on in class. And I'm like, great, I have no idea what you're talking about. So what, kind of thing. And then he'll kind of say like, oh, okay, well, we're redoing these power lines because of this reason, and it's going to help people in this way, and it's going to help people get their power back after a disaster faster, whatever it might be. But normally if you ask enough so what's, what you get to at the end is like that little nugget of gold that you're sifting for as a communications professional. And if you ask enough so what's, that's the thing that's going to be the headline, like redoing power structure saves millions after a disaster by restoring power quicker. Like that will be the thing that you get to that is the headline. And I think that's especially valuable for something like Campus as a Living Lab, where a lot of the projects might be technical. And so you might have to do a little bit of sifting and do a little bit of work to get to that so what, where not only does it make sense for an audience that might be less technical, but it also answers that question that I think we implicitly are always kind of asking as we go through life. And that's so what. There's so much content there's so many things that your thumb can scroll through on a given day. And so by being a little bit critical on the forefront and asking that question, I think you arrive at that kind of like nugget of gold a little bit quicker, and you get a better product out of it in the end. And so to me, that's one of the most valuable things. And then I will also say, as like working with the only communications professional in a room in my current role, I do work with a team. I work with the community and media relations team, but often when I'm working with other county departments or other folks out in the community, I am kind of the only person who's looking through that communications lens. And so when you work with other communications professionals and going through a Campus as a Living Lab program or whatever it might be, usually those people are asking the so what questions, or they're asking kind of a lot of questions in general in a day. My predominant responsibility is just to be the one asking all the questions, so that I can make sure that I can then turn around and communicate that in a way that makes sense to the appropriate audiences. And so my advice with working with communication professionals would be to always interpret questions as kind of like love wrapped in maybe a abrasive wrapping paper. When a communications professional is asking questions, it's normally to make the product better in the long run. And so a lot of my process that I like to lean on is going from like the big goals to the objectives, so how we're going to reach those goals, and then to the strategy. And so if you're working with a communications person, they're going to be relying on you to set the big goals of the program. So what's the big goal? Like, what we want to grow the program, we want to market the university, we want, like, these are the big overarching themes. And then you'll work together probably on a strategy. So how are we going to reach those goals? And this is a really good time to lean on the expertise of storytellers who might be in the room that have a good sense for how to match the story with the medium. And so I think a lot of times it's important to keep that in mind too, because it's easy to put the strategy before the goal sometimes. Like, we can look at something and say like, oh, well, this would be great for video, or this would be great on social media, or I want to do a blog post about this, and you jump right to that. But I think sometimes taking a step back and just thinking about what are the goals, what are the objectives, how are we going to meet those goals, and then what's the strategy that's going to help us accomplish those objectives, and just making sure that everything is kind of happening in an order that makes sense has been really valuable for me, both in my role now with Leon County government, and then also working in the sustainability office at FSU. So I think that's probably getting pretty close to 10 minutes, so I will wrap that up. But again, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you to all of our speakers for staying so on exactly the 10-minute mark. At this time, I would like to open it up to questions. And to kick things off, sometimes we learn more from failures than we do from successes. So I'm curious to hear from all the panelists. Can you share an example of a communications failure, if you have one, and what you learned from that, and how our audience can maybe learn from that failure as well?
Well, I'll jump in real quickly. I feel like a failure that we often discuss at the Office of Sustainability is we put a lot of effort into our communications, create videos that we think are pretty nifty, and we put them out into the world. And some of the good videos will get thousands of views, and we think we've done a pretty good job. But a video that we think is just as good will get 100 views or 200 views or 50 views. And we live in a very noisy world where it's hard to get people to pay attention. So we've been starting to put a lot more effort into thinking through our distribution channels and where the video has value, or if it doesn't have value, maybe not making it. So we're always wishing that there was more eyeballs on our work and more ways to share it.
Yeah, I'll say similar. There's not necessarily one failure that stands out, but I think for me, like the failure feeling comes from like doing a thing to say we did a thing, or because somebody asked for a thing. And so like I've felt that before when it jumps right to the strategy, right? So like that's the thing that I was talking about, where it's like, oh, well, we need to do a video because we need to do a video, but the project might not necessarily lend itself super well to video. Like it might not be this really visual thing, whereas like, a long form article could be really, really cool. And so those are the moments that kind of stand out to me as just like, you know, it could have been better if it was different.
Yeah, I think just echoing Jared and Michelle, like sometimes you have this vision and it's just hard to put all the pieces together. And so I think understanding if you're taking like one research project that you're looking at, you're thinking, oh, this is the most exciting research project. I want to get all the information out, but maybe it's just the timing isn't right. I think sometimes we failed because we sort of, like to Jared's point earlier, going through the entire start to finish of a project isn't always feasible, because sometimes you find out about it later. Maybe the Office of Sustainability at Princeton funds a lot of the research projects, so we're kind of in from the ground and then we follow it throughout. But if we're finding out about it at the end, so how does that story look? And sometimes the failure comes from just choosing the timing is wrong or the platform is wrong. And so sort of to Michelle's point too, taking a step back and thinking about, okay, what's the best strategy for this particular project? And sometimes you just make, I don't know, not a mistake necessarily, sometimes it just doesn't hit. And so that's something you just kind of have to take a step back and say, okay, what could we do differently next time? Or, maybe there's another way to package this in a different way, because to be honest, like Jared said, like things are happening so fast, like try it again a month later, and you would be surprised. Maybe someone would really hit, like maybe the timing of it works really well for something else. Like maybe there's something big in the news that's related, throw it back out there and it might do better. So.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. If you are familiar with Zoom and know how to use the raise hand feature, please go ahead and raise your hand. It makes it really easy to know when someone has a question. Okay, Rochelle.
I couldn't resist. Thanks to all the presenters for sharing your time and insights. I got a lot of gold nuggets out of what you shared. A question that comes to mind for me is, I'm curious for your thoughts in involving students in creating a product. So not so much just the student voice. How about using students to create content, let's say short videos for Instagram or create blog content? If you have experience doing it, what would you say keep doing? What would you say stop doing? Or just generally looking for your insights on that. And I guess a part of that is, what are your thoughts on almost guerrilla type content where it's not that institutional polish, it doesn't have that institutional polish to it, and yet it's authentic within these post-secondary institutions where we work? Thanks very much.
If it's okay, I'd love to jump on this question. So when I was at Princeton, I managed a whole team of students specific for communications. So I had students that provided content for our social media, students that sometimes supported Jared with video or did their own videos, students that also created that newsletter we shared was actually mostly put together by a student. And I would 100% work with students. Not only do they know what students like, they are students, so they have their friends that maybe they have heard of different projects, or they have ideas of what is interesting or what's happening on campus. They have that student voice that sometimes we as professionals in our offices just aren't quite hitting. And to the question about sort of polished, so the great thing about social media in particular is it really doesn't have to be this polished thing. I mean, Jared's videos are spectacular, and they're wonderful for the research and showcasing that. But sometimes there's nothing wrong with just sending a student out to get some video or some images, or putting together something for Instagram or TikTok. And honestly, creating them within the app, they typically perform better. The algorithm favors everything when you do them within the app to begin with. So it's fine if it looks a little gritty. The students, that's what they resonate with. But yeah, I would 100%, and pay your students. That's another thing, just pay your students. I know not all offices have the funds to do that, but try to find a way, because you're gonna get the best students if you're able to pay them, and they deserve to be paid. And yeah, be happy to talk offline about working with students, because it's a great way to really hone in on communications.
So similarly to Lisa, when I worked for sustainability at FSU, I also managed a team of 2 students on the communications team. And so I'll echo a lot of Lisa's points to say that, yes, for social media, like it doesn't have to necessarily be the most polished or perfect thing. And in a lot of ways, that authenticity is really resonant, especially with student audiences. And so I think that that's kind of something to lean into. But I do think that it's good to have a collaborative approach to those things. So it's not just like, go do, but to really talk through the project beforehand and make sure that students have a good handle on the why and the so what, so that they kind of understand the guiding goal or like the through line of that. It makes it a little bit more of a clear story, and then it makes it a clear ask for students who are going out into the field to do those things as well. So I absolutely love it when students create content. I think to echo Lisa's points as well, like they do really creative and nuanced things. And I think in sustainability, nuance is a really important like secret ingredient, I guess, to sprinkle in there, because for the audiences who have an interest in sustainability already, I think there's like a lot of stories that have already kind of been told in numerous ways. And then for people who aren't going out seeking out sustainability content, you know, like those traditional beats might not really capture their attention. So I think any ways to kind of add a fresh perspective or some nuance to a story is really valid, as a really valid way to get attention. And students are a really great way to kind of interject some nuance, just because they maybe have less time to kind of soak in all of those traditional narratives that we've all kind of heard and seen already.
All right, Jared, would you like to add anything to that question as well?
Well, I haven't worked as much with students as Lisa has. I think just a related thought I would add is that, you know, especially with Campus as Lab at Princeton, it seems like there's so much work being done on campus, probably tens of millions of dollars worth of construction, a lot of it to do with infrastructure. And in some cases, the only photos or video that exists of what's happening just happens to be what I shot one day with my camera and, you know, with all the people on the campus. So Campus as Lab is very visual and a real opportunity to collect information, visual information, even when you don't know how you're going to use it. So I think the idea of empowering your students or your office to do this, because sometimes nobody else will, is important. If you have a smaller budget and you don't have a videographer or a part-time videographer like me, I actually think the best investment an office can make is probably about $2,000 to $3,000 in a really nice full frame camera with a lens. You know, cell phone photos are good too, but photos are a lot easier and less time expensive to take than video. So I think just making sure there's somebody, whether it's a student or someone in your office, taking photos of things while they happen. Sometimes years later, those photos are still used.
Great, wonderful advice. So we have Kaylin, Marilyn, and then Ijoma, and hopefully we'll have time for more questions after that, but we'll see. Such great answers from everyone. So Kaylin, if you'd like to ask a question.
Thanks. Hi, I'm coming from University of Vermont today, and we are starting a Campus as Lab initiative, and we do not have any communications people. No one is trained in communications in our office, and very limited support from the central communications team at the university. So wondering what you see as like the bare bones, the must-haves, starting a new Campuses Living Lab initiative, and like what are those key communication messages or ways that you found people were understanding what Campuses Lab is, or just, you know, what you would definitely not want to skip. Like Jared said, the camera, that's great advice.
I guess I could just quickly start by saying, I mean, the basis of most communications from your office is usually on a website of some sort. If you already have, your office website or a platform somewhere on your institution's website, having some, place where that information can be, even if it's just a contact me to learn more, something just to sort of set that. And then, building from there, whether you're highlighting projects or highlighting, that information, I think that's a good place to start. Before maybe, especially if you don't already have a lot of communications, you don't want to just start creating all of these platforms because you have to think about your strategy. I would also say making those connections with the academic departments. I know Ajoma, and I'm sure many of you do this, but just reaching out and having those meetings, having those chats, and maybe doing presentations to courses, to classes that Campus's Lab could be a part of or already is a part of if the class has sort of a campus component, and just making those connections so that you're, getting that information. And then once you have that information, if there's a project happening, then you can start to think about, okay, how am I going to start communicating about this, whether it's a story or a video or however you want to approach it. And I'm trying to think. Yeah, I'll stop talking. Does anyone want to chime? And feel free, others on the call that are more focused on Campus's Lab, like this is also, feel free to chime in from what you've done.
I would add that don't be afraid to occasionally outsource your communications. If there's a really important story you have to tell. I don't know how other universities work, but all the time Princeton University hires outside photographers and videographers and brings them in to tell certain stories. I actually get hired sometimes by different departments at Princeton University to do something totally different. I think that kind of like simple student-made hold up your iPhone video can be really effective in some cases. In other cases, you need something really polished, and kind of the amateur polished video never works out. So it may cost $3 to $4 or $5 or more $1,000 to make a video, but if that specific video can bring in, $100,000 worth of support in a future funding, it's paid for itself. So there are, in the same way that, there's a lot of people who want to be in a rock band who teach guitar lessons. There's a lot of documentary filmmakers like me out there who, all the time work sometimes for a university to tell stories.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, this is probably my current role kind of bleeding into the answer to this question. I do a lot of media relations daily, but I know that it's difficult to always kind of have university communications in your pocket. So they might not cover every single thing, but I would encourage you, if there is a central communications person that maybe you can kind of just befriend or kind of have an honest conversation with, and ask that person, how do you like to receive information? What are your goals, and understanding the goals of central communication? Because then when you do have those big things and those stories that are worth maybe hiring a vendor to come in and help tell, knowing how central communications, do they want a press release? Do they want kind of how they want to be communicated with? Did they want the visuals? Did they want to send their photographer out to take photos? Kind of understanding their process will make it easier to get their attention in the times that it matters, because they also have their goals of trying to serve the university and communicate the things that are going on campus. And so if you are able to get even just kind of an informational interview conversation going with a representative from your central communications, that was something that I was able to do when I worked at sustainability at FSU, and it was really, really valuable, because then I knew the person who I could just say hey, we have this thing coming up, can I send you a press release? Can I send you some images? And just kind of knowing how they like to receive information, and then using that kind of sparingly, knowing when it's time to rely on central communications. I think they can be a really valuable tool, especially for getting press outside of the university. So they're used to working with local media. And so if there are those stories that you think really have legs, and you want them to kind of go beyond just the campus ecosystem, I think that's a really valuable relationship to forge, and then just whatever they say, if they say they want a press release, just developing that template. So anytime you have something that comes up, it's just easy to kind of plug in the information and send it off.
Great advice. Marilyn, you're up next.
Thanks. I'm interested in any comments about communicating not entirely positive things like, challenges or barriers at the university, and whether that's political concerns or how to do that effectively.
That's a really great question. I will just give one example. So in this past year and a half, COVID really hit our campus hard in terms of and I'm sure many of you experienced this, reversing maybe a lot of, things that had been done over the years to reduce waste or to really advance sustainability operationally on our campus. And so much of that just kind of either stopped, halted, it felt like a whole new campus. And we had students who've never experienced, students for the very first time coming to our campus, like, what is this? Why is everything disposable? Why are we throwing so much in the garbage? There's so much waste, all of that. So during that time, one of the biggest things that we did was try to be as transparent as possible and really say, this is what's happening. This is what's happening not just here at Princeton, but around the country, around the world. We're in a pandemic. This is obviously a very specific example, but just trying to be as transparent as possible with not only what the current situation was, but also where we were in the past and where we were looking to go to in the future, and trying to give, not like lots of promises, because we honestly had no idea what could happen in the next few months, but as tangible as possible, and then inviting students in particular, but students, faculty, staff, to be part of conversations about what was happening. We had a virtual panel with students and staff who were involved operationally to talk about what was happening in dining, what was happening on campus. And so it was a way for people to really express their concerns, but also to have that transparency. And another thing that we did after the fact was we actually did a whole series on our Instagram, on our social media, about all of the waste on campus. And we said, this is how much waste this is what happened. We were very transparent about it. A student did this as part of a communications class, actually, where she had to create a documentary. So we highlighted her documentary. It just won an award at the Post Landfill Action Network conference, which was cool. So I can put it in the chat. But really just trying to not hide behind what was happening, because it was so clearly happening. And this is just obviously very specific, but people appreciate that. And then they want to work with you to fix that problem, whatever it might be. So this is obviously around waste, but maybe it's around energy or water usage or something like that. But to me personally, I am all for transparency and just trying to make sure that everyone is part of your plan, and make them feel included in what you're trying to do, and not just be like, everything's fine, because that doesn't work.
Yeah, I would add quickly, from my perspective, I don't think universities and big organizations overall do a good job telling negative stories. They stay away from them for the most part. I run into stories about wastefulness that I thought were incredibly compelling that never really got anywhere. And I kind of mentioned at the beginning of my talk that I actually feel like there's a difference between when I go out and make a documentary film and when I work for Princeton or a big organization. And the difference is that documentary filmmaking is about conflict and overcoming problems, whereas I think sometimes these big organizations and universities are a little risk adverse to tell that story. But those are the stories that build credibility, and more importantly, that people learn from. So I think the next big movement in kind of what I see as this form of communications is to embrace that bad stuff and start talking about it more. That would be really exciting.
I agree with both my fellow panelists, Lisa, that it's important to be authentic and transparent. And then Jared, obviously, in order to say like we overcame, you have to kind of talk a little bit about the maybe less savory parts of that story. I think for me, if I were to add a couple things, it would just be the difference between like being the story and then amplifying a story. So being strategic about the source. Like, is there a way that you could amplify maybe students or faculty who are kind of saying the things that you want to say, but you as the Office of Sustainability at X University can't say, but you have kind of the tools to amplify that voice? And then there's also the idea of like a process. So working in local government, there are things that, you know, local government might do that our constituency or that citizens might not necessarily agree with. But it's important for me and my office that we communicate the process. So it's not that we're just arbitrarily arriving at this point, right? Like we're not just doing a thing based on no research or reason or thought. And so a lot of the communications isn't just about the thing, it's about the process that arrived like to the thing, right? So for Waste on Campus, right, like not that you need to give this long-winded explanation of like, well, COVID and excuses necessarily, but like I think people really just want to know that there's a process and they want to know that their considerations are heard and they want to know that it is a difficult choice sometimes and they want to know that there are multiple stakeholders and like in any way that you can make that into a compelling story, you know, I think that that can go a long way in both owning that there is a problem and two, saying that we didn't arrive at the point that we are just because.
Wonderful. We have a question here in the chat specifically for Michelle. So Joma asks, what is the best strategy for creating a podcast to communicate research, and how resource intensive are podcasts in terms of staff time and other costs?
So podcasts are very resource intensive. I'll say like starting my own podcast, I'm kind of at the point where I started off maybe without the best plan. So I kind of started off where it was just me kind of talking and it was like pages and pages. Like my research, my episode notes were like 10 pages for each episode. And it's based on a lot of the research that I did in grad school. So I kind of had the base, but it just got to a point where I couldn't kind of continue. It wasn't sustainable. And so the point that I'm at now is switching to an interview model, which I think is a really great model to adopt, especially for something like research projects. But then the trick is getting people who are like audiogenic, you know, like we talk about like photogenic or telegenic, but like you want people who are like compelling in that medium, which I think sometimes can be a little difficult. But the plus is that you're not just sitting down and having this like unedited, uninterrupted conversation with someone for an hour. It's like you get to kind of make that story, but you need somebody who can hit the beats, like who can really talk about their research. And then on the back end of that, you or whomever is going to be editing the podcast need to have an ear for like when you hear those things that's like, oh, this is it, like this one sentence that this person just said, flag that in whatever software you're using to edit, like and just say like this has to be in, or make a note for yourself when you're recording, and kind of know the outline as you're kind of going along. But in terms of cost, podcasts really don't have to be expensive. The podcast hosting, I think, is relatively cost effective. You can get a lot for a little bit. I think a good microphone is a good investment. A lot of times people will forgive kind of shoddy video, but especially on social media, but not in something like documentary or anything. Like I don't mean to say that video is not something that people will look at, but like for audio quality, a good mic will go a long way. And you know, those are just kind of the startup costs, but there is the time cost as well. And then also finding people who will be compelling interviewees can be a challenge, but I think it's worthwhile. I think it's a really great storytelling mechanism.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle. And I also wanted to highlight Ijoma for helping us arrange this panel today. So thank you so much for your work, Ijoma. I'm sorry that I jumped in and didn't let you ask your question yourself. Because we are running out of time, I will just wrap things up with one final question and one big thank you to our panelists once again for sharing your wisdom with us today. What is the one thing that non-communications folks should do to support their communications team? And I know Michelle talked about this a little bit, but from everyone's perspective, what can we as Campuses Lab or sustainability professionals do to help make your lives easier?
Know that questions are love. Like that's my big, like questions are love. If your communications person is asking you questions, it means that they love you and that they want the project to succeed. And it's not to be critical of the project or to imply that like you don't know what's going on. It's like they're asking the questions that they know that other people are gonna have. So questions are love. That's my advice.
I think just, yeah, I love that. Questions are love. I think just working together, I love like brainstorming and having like, don't feel like you're not a creative person just because you may not know communications. Everyone has great ideas. So coming to, the table and sitting and just talking about what's on your plate with like research projects, what are they, like having that conversation about, what kind of story could this be? And, for the most part, you're going to know those projects better than the communications person will, because they're going to be asking you all these questions, right? So coming to that and being open to like any possibility to take that, that project and highlight it and feel, feel like engage in the creative process, I would say.
Yeah, I think when you make videos like I do, you run into dozens, hundreds of thousands of people who say, oh, I don't like being on camera, or I'm nervous. And some people are nervous and some people are just, being humble, like they would actually do it. But, you have to come in with a certain sense of like, oh, no, I don't want to do it. But if you know something, like if you are a subject matter expert on something, you sharing that information is incredibly valuable to me and to people who watch it. So I would say just like own it and be like, yeah, let's do this. And making movies can be a lot of fun, and being in videos can be a lot of fun. So instead of like having the dour, like, oh, I'll do the video, but oh, did I look bad? No, just like go for it, because that makes it the whole process more fun for everybody.
All right, well, thank you again so much to everyone. Thank you for everyone who attended. Again, this will be uploaded to our Google Drive after the fact. So you can come back, check out this video, share it with your colleagues, and learn from our valuable subject matter experts. So thank you again, everyone. At this time, I'll stop recording.